So now we're going to segue. I'm going to introduce the next panelist and the host. It's going to be Varun Ranjan.
Thank you. Afternoon, everyone. Been great session so far. We're going to talk a little bit about investing in brain health now, and great esteemed panel. And if I could please invite everyone to stage. I'll have everyone introduce themselves. But what I really love about this panel we've put together is that we're starting off with Jacob Sofonieva thinking about de-risk science. How do you invest in those later stage across neurological diseases and broader diseases? We have Niranjan who's going to talk more from that venture philanthropy perspective. And then Karthik really talking about how do we think about early stage de-risk science? How do you do those earlier seed investments? So it's great that we have such a diverse perspective about how we really think about investing in brain health specifically. So I'll just do a quick introduction, then I would love for everyone to introduce themselves as well. So I'm Varun Ranjan. I'm a partner at Putnam Associates. It's a consulting firm. I'm a physician, moved over to strategy consulting 15 years ago, and I lead our portfolio licensing development practice, thinking about how do you invest and grow portfolios organically and inorganically itself. Work almost exclusively in neurological diseases, and I've been fortunate that I have done the diligence and investment thesis behind a couple of the recent neuro life science deals specifically. So with that, I would love for him to introduce yourselves. Jacob, please go ahead.
Yeah, it's great to be with you here in Texas. So I'm Jacob Dupont. I'm an executive partner at Sofinova. So we are a US-based venture capital firm. We tend to invest in private companies, mainly clinical stage across all therapeutic areas, including neurology. I happen to be an oncologist by training, physician scientist as well. So we do invest in oncology, and obviously MD Anderson is right down the street, so it's always great to be in the vicinity of such a fantastic institution. I'm a drug developer by training. Academic career first at Sloan Kettering and then at Stanford, and then 17 years in industry at Genentech Roche. Half of that time developing a bunch of cancer drugs, and then chief medical officer for a couple of California biotechs and head of R&D for a cell therapy company. But now on the investment side and really interested in finding those great next companies that are going to make the innovations that are going to change outcomes for patients, and certainly looking at the greatest unmet need, whether it's in cancer or whether it's in dementia and neurology. This is really the passion that we're all involved in.
I want to thank all the organizers and Vineet for the opportunity to be here, and it's a really remarkable event. I'm Karthik. I'm one of the partners at Google Ventures. The main thing to know about Google Ventures is that we're an entirely independent fund. So our singular LP and source of capital is Alphabet, but as a fund, we operate entirely independently like any other venture capital fund. The fund invests about $1.5 billion US per year across tech and life sciences. And I would say within life sciences, what makes us quite unique is that we invest across stages. So you'll see partners at GV doing everything from $5-10 million seed checks into incubations out of academia, incubations out of industry spinouts, all the way to $50-100 million checks for late stage phase 2 or 3 assets. We invest across therapeutic areas, across modalities. And I think one of the things that's nice about our ability to be stage agnostic is we're able to follow companies through their entire life cycle. So if you look at a company like Verve Therapeutics, which was one of our original incubations, that was something that we put dollars into when it was just a white piece of paper that said, hey, wouldn't it be cool if you could do a one and done shot to reduce your LDL by 50%? We were able to invest in that company when it was a white piece of paper, and at every single stage, all the way to when it was in a public market before it was acquired by Lilly, we were able to put money into that company. And so that's a really special journey that we're able to go on with founders and be able to be there through what is a long cycle of drug development. I'm by background a neurobiologist. I studied autism from a developmental perspective, trying to understand what goes awry in the first trimester of human development. I then took a fairly substantial detour. I was a quant for a hedge fund in New York called E. Shaw. I worked on statistical learning and algorithmic trading systems, but every night I'd come home and read Cell papers because that's what gave me happiness and joy in life. And now I get to do that for a living. So very happy to be here.
Well, good afternoon. Varun, thank you. Vineet, thank you for having me here. Niranjan Bose with Gates Ventures. Before I introduce myself, I'll lodge a complaint. It's an unfair act to follow. You can't have us go after Diallo. What a talk. Gates Ventures is Bill Gates' private office. I lead our work in healthcare, life sciences, most of which is focused in Alzheimer's and related dementias from a philanthropic perspective. We started our journey about 8 years ago, focusing mostly on biomarkers, diagnostics, therapeutics, and how do you make the patient journey better, whether it's care seeking or whether it's enrollment in clinical trials. And we're not a traditional venture capital firm. We're not a charitable foundation. So we can take whatever color you want us to take. We just want to get the job done. Thank you.
Wonderful. So in my 15 years, it's been really interesting to see how the ebbs and flow of neurology has been from a life science perspective. It's almost been, for a few years, it's almost like watching a bad horror movie on repeat. You would have this amazing phase 2 data, enter phase 3, and then you invariably see a failure again and again in neurological diseases. And I think what's been exciting is that we now do realize that these are complex, heterogeneous diseases, and we have to think about really that like the precision medicine aspect itself. So ASCO, the big oncology conference, just wrapped up, and precision medicine has been very much at the forefront. Jacob and I were talking, pancreatic cancer, there was a data came out, 13 or 14 patients, 94% response rate. So we're seeing this in oncology, and now we're really thinking about how do we bring this to neurological diseases, both neurological as well as mental health. So Jacob, as an oncologist, as you think about what have been some of the key learnings from precision medicine oncology, and how do we bring that to neurological diseases to move the investment thesis forward?
And I think this deep effort that's happening here in Texas and being in this Houston ecosystem where MD Anderson's right down the street, I mean, there's been so much innovation that's occurred in this ecosystem when it comes to patient subsets, understanding biology, and then providing targeted therapies for patients. This is actually something that we've been doing in oncology probably for about 25 years now. But it was a long journey, I would say, and maybe an example, when I was at Genentech long ago, we had a drug called Tarceva, which was a small molecule against something called the epidermal growth factor receptor, and you can get a mutation in patients who had a certain type of lung cancer. Now, when the trial was first run, there was a marginal benefit for patients on the big phase 3 trial. And part of the problem there was that we had the wrong biomarker hypothesis. We thought that if you look for that protein on the lung cancer cells and you gave this particular targeted therapy, that lo and behold, you were going to have this massive treatment benefit. We didn't see that. There was a very small separation between the curves. But subsequently, science occurred. Some of these tumors were actually sequenced by physicians at Harvard and New York at Sloan Kettering, and they found a mutation in this EGFR receptor. So it was not the protein, it was that mutation that was really what was so important in terms of that targeted therapy. So when they reanalyzed the trial, looking at the subset of patients that had the right biomarker, you could see a massive treatment effect. It was in a smaller population of patients, but it was very clear that we had the right hypothesis, the right therapeutic hypothesis, the right patient population, and we had the right mousetrap to treat those patients. So I think when it comes to lessons to neurology and dementia and so forth, I think it's probably a similar thing. We know there's a lot of heterogeneity in neurological disease, whether it's advanced Alzheimer's, early Alzheimer's, where there are different, biomarker drivers with plaques and so forth, amyloid and so forth. But understanding these subsets and understanding the therapy that's actually going to be important for those subsets, that's probably where you're going to drive a lot of innovation. So I would say it's one example. There are many, many other examples in oncology. But I think the great news is you've got experts that have lived this for the last 20 or 30 years right down the street at MD Anderson. So it's in your ecosystem already.
Karthik, same question. How do we think about moving precision medicine forward in neurology?
Yeah, so I think one thing that is a little different about oncologic settings, right, is it is a necessarily faster evolving condition, right? So studying the genetics, biopsying samples, looking at sequencing, you're able to kind of treat roughly at the time at which you are studying some of those genetic drivers and sampling some of those genetic drivers. What's a little hard about neurodegenerative condition, it is necessarily a much more slowly evolving thing. And so we have a very good understanding of some of the genetic drivers that are the initial hit. But if what we do as a regulatory apparatus is ask that we treat patients that are much further along in the disease journey, then maybe the initial genetic hit is the right place to look, but also maybe it is a different pathology by the time we're treating patients. And so if you were to ask my opinion of what precision medicine will look like in neurological disease is I think we will need to abstract away one additional layer just from the straight genetics. I think if I take an example like TDP-43 pathology, TDP-43 pathology has long been considered to account for the majority of ALS cases, but now if people are looking in frontotemporal dementia, they're looking in Alzheimer's, and they're seeing signatures of a TDP-43 pathology in large percentages of these patients. It's not 100%, but it's 30, 40, 50%. The same can be said of alpha-synuclein pathology. And so I think what we will need to do is really focus on the abstraction of biomarkers, whether it's imaging biomarkers, whether it's blood markers, and less connected to the core genetics, but more connected to what is the pathology that is happening in cells at the time that we are treating these patients, which is much later in their disease course, and different patients evolve differently. So, that's what I'm excited about. There are more companies out there that are, for example, trying to drug TDP-43 itself. What we will need is to accompany that with a biomarker and imaging set that can tell us which patients have a TDP-43opathy. And I think we should start thinking like that rather than ALS or Alzheimer's or Parkinson's.
And then Nirjan, same question to you. As we think about precision medicine and neurological diseases, neurodegenerative diseases, what are some of the considerations you're thinking about as you continue to move forward investments across these serious diseases?
Sure. Early on in my career, I was told there are three main reasons why drugs fail. 1, wrong dose. 2, wrong target. 3, wrong population. And I won't name the person, but in this audience, yesterday, I heard one of the reasons why company X's late-stage amyloid removal trial failed is we enrolled people who didn't have amyloid in the trial. Again, wrong population. So we've clumped Alzheimer's as one disease. Before we even talk about precision medicine, I think we need to subtype. It may not be one disease. It may be 3, it may be 5, it may be 10. It could be mixed dementias. I think we need to start that journey. Starting subtyping, I think, will get us to precision approaches.
So I think what Nirjan just said is absolutely critical. We think of all dementias as being Alzheimer's, but it's an incredibly heterogeneous set of diseases. And the parallel I give is to how we thought about lung cancer 20 years ago, where we threw chemotherapy at everyone, and now we have all the different subtypes. You mentioned EGFR, ALK1, ROS1, PD1. And I think that's where we are going with dementia to a certain extent, but it's not just these biomarkers, it's populations, it's 2 to 1 women to men. It's different amongst different ethnicities. And we've heard a lot about AI and all these different tools, but one of the other powerful tools that we do have is data. So Niranjan, thinking about some of the work you're doing with the data collection and data venture, specifically at Gates, how do we leverage and invest in data to really move forward treatments itself?
Yeah, I can go on and on and on, but I'll try and be short. I mean, data, historically, getting access to data, retrospective clinical trial data sets has been hugely difficult. If we don't learn from why a particular trial failed, I don't think we can convince ourselves that we will design the right trial for the future. So that's the main reason why a group of us, about 15 organizations, came together to start what is now called the Alzheimer's Disease Data Initiative. And we're operating with one singular mission. Can we make data sets as widely findable, requestable, available in the dementia field, not just Alzheimer's? Let's consider it one spectrum. Let's bring in ALS data sets, FTD, Parkinson's, Lewy body dementias. With that enabling environment, will we be able to identify some data scientists who may be able to pose new, novel, interesting questions that lead to new biomarkers, new targets, new modalities, new hypotheses? Why do women get more Alzheimer's than men? We all have our own hypotheses, but shouldn't we be testing that in a systematic way? That's the data journey we want to be on.
Jacob?
Yeah, and maybe to expand on that as well, I do think this analysis of what leads to successful drug development or poor or unsuccessful drug development, I think we have learned about these other failure areas, and a lot of it is patient variability. So I've been involved, unfortunately, in a number of trials where we didn't correctly manage all the variables in a trial. And so this gets back to understanding these populations of patients with dementia, and can you ask a focused question in a relatively homogeneous population where you're controlling for as many of those variables as possible. I think another factor, which I think is very important also in neurological disease and Alzheimer's and so forth, are the endpoints that we're using. So as we begin to understand the different populations in dementia, we also have to have a great understanding of what are the endpoints that actually translate into clinical benefits for patients as well. And I think, that has been something that we've evolved in oncology over the years, where there are certain endpoints in leukemia and so forth. We look at minimal residual disease, which is a blood test to show that patients are on the right track towards remission. But these are endpoints that we had to identify. Another example is minimal residual, or the neoadjuvant setting, where you give patients chemo in the setting of a bulky disease circumstance, and you try to reduce them, and that can correlate with outcomes and survival for patients. But my point being, for dementia and neurological disease, we have to understand those endpoints that really link to clinical benefit. And it's also, to your point, how long the timelines are. So this is actually really hard in terms of if we give an intervention, but we're talking about years of evolution of dementia. We can't run a trial that's going to take 10 years to read out. That's just not efficient. So we have to find those intermediate endpoints that really translate into clinical benefits so we can get drugs approved and get them to patients as well. So I think patient populations and endpoints are also critical.
So something we did here yesterday in one of the panelist discussions is that you start to have pathological changes of the brain 15, 20 years before the initial symptomology. So I think of myself in my 40s, if I have dementia in 20 years, I don't know what's happening in my brain right now. Getting back to not just data, but we all have smartphones, we're all using wearables. There's all this amazing technology that tracks things like sleep, heart rate. So Karthik, thinking about that perspective and some of these different technologies, how do we develop those and how do we invest in those technologies itself to really think about diagnosing brain diseases more efficiently or earlier on so we have more successful outcomes?
Yeah. So there's a lot of work going on in this field that I think is quite interesting, and I like to draw the analogy to cardiovascular disease. If you look at where we are right now in cardiovascular disease and where I think we'll be in the next 5-10 years, it's really quite a remarkable place, right? So with GLP-1s, people will experience 10-20% weight loss. With PCSK9 inhibitors, people will reduce 50%, 60% LDL numbers, will reduce Lp(a), will reduce hypertension with zilebesiran. I mean, we're really kind of attacking 5 different cardiovascular risk variables, and we're hitting them with effect sizes of 50%. And so, I think we will see meaningful reduction in cardiovascular events as people start taking these medications earlier and earlier in life, and they reduce their cumulative risk burden. But that's a field in cardiovascular disease that's developed in 30, 40 years. Cardiologists have been telling people to take statins in their 40s for a long time now, but it's a thing that takes time. And I think where we are right now in neurodegenerative disease and things like dementia is we don't exactly know those units yet. We don't know weight, blood pressure, Lp(a). Like, we don't know those sort of simple things that you can measure at a primary care center or on a blood test, such that the regulatory apparatus can start catching up and saying, oh, if I see a 50% reduction in this unit, that is objectively good, right? So that's where I feel we are right now, which is, what is that variable for dementia, right? I think the critical study that I think should be run, that hasn't been run yet, is we can do sleep EEGs very easily now. In fact, there are a bunch of portable EEG companies now. There is probably a very clear variable in sleep EEG quality that I think is the exact map to LDL. If your sleep quality, as measured by this one variable, is poor for 30 years, you probably have a meaningfully increased risk of dementia. But until we find out what that variable is, until we find out someone who is willing to take the risk to run that study that shows that variable correlates to dementia risk, it becomes really hard to do development for drugs that are in this more sort of preventative space, right? Because the regulators need to believe that I don't have to wait 10 years to see the outcome of dementia. I know that if you are not sleeping well today and you haven't been sleeping well for 5 years and you can improve that with a drug, then that's a drug worth pushing to patients. And I think that's where we are. I think we are making progress, but it's slow and steady.
So the GLP-1 semaglutide unfortunately did fail its phase 3 in Alzheimer's. I know there was some hope it did fail. But as we look at that data, do you think there's learnings that we could take to develop more of those preventative types of therapeutics for dementia in the future? And I'll open this question to everyone on the panel.
Yeah, I think the answer is absolutely going to be yes, because I think we are just beginning to scratch the surface when it comes to understanding the impacts of these drugs. I think we see other brain function effects of the drugs. You think about the appetite centers and some of the addictive things that occur. There's no doubt that there's an impact on brain function in that regard. I also think that it's really interesting to see in autoimmune disease, for example, when patients lose a substantial amount of weight, what the impact can be on autoimmune disease, whether it's psoriasis or lupus and so forth, where patients will actually go into remission as they lose a substantial amount of weight as well. So I think there's an inflammatory component to obesity, and I think inflammation is probably a pretty important element when it comes to dementia and Alzheimer's disease as well. So I think there could very well be a link there. Again, this is something the great news is we're going to get more and more data from this class of drugs because they are being utilized so much. There's so many studies ongoing, and the biological impact on them has such a broad application. Again, taking it back to oncology, We know that there are certain tumor types that are also driven, or you have a greater risk of certain tumors like endometrial cancer in an obese state, and that also has to do with, hormones that are being generated by adipose tissue and so forth. So I do think, again, the impact of weight loss, the decrease in inflammation, the changes in hormones and so forth that can occur because of that, I think they're going to probably have impacts on brain function as well. But again, we'll learn more of this in the coming years. It's going to be very exciting.
Niranjan, please go
I
ahead.
mean, we absolutely have to be thinking about prevention when it comes to Alzheimer's and related dementias. Many of you might have heard the observational data that came out about the shingles vaccine. Shingles vaccine reduces the risk of dementia onset. The effect size varies from 15 to 20, 25%. I don't understand the mechanism, but I know there is absolute risk reduction happening, right? I'm going to leave the mechanistic journey to the scientists, but it tells me that prevention or risk reduction is feasible in this bucket called dementia. And if you take a simplistic approach to amyloid and tau, I'm not a card-carrying amyloid or tau researcher. I don't have any horse in the race, but this is my understanding. Amyloid builds up, hits a certain threshold, triggers tau, tau propagation, seeding and propagation causes havoc. If I can keep my amyloid at a certain level and don't let it go above that threshold that triggers tau, maybe we can get home free.
Karthik, any other perspectives about preventative dementia, preventative diseases itself, preventive states, and how we can invest in those specifically?
I think it was mostly covered here, but I do think that a lot of the variables in cardiovascular and I&I will have contributions to reduction in dementia risk. I think it is very important to isolate that element though, right? Because that's what allows people to then focus on a single mechanistic or variable axis and develop more there, right? So if you take GLP-1s, for example, I mean, people have some sense of how it works, right? But if you ask people, well, which GLP-1 positive neurons is different drugs acting on? We don't know. Which side of the blood-brain barrier is it on? We don't know. So, by slowly deconvolving some elements of how this works, maybe we will be able to get to something that says the mechanism by which GLP-1 shows effects in something like PD or dementia is maybe on the neuroinflammation axis, right? Maybe we can isolate it to a series of peripheral CSF cytokines that we can say this correlates to an exposure-response relationship. And I think if we can identify that, that's what sparks a series of next-generation drugs that try to kind of tap further into that effect, right? It may be the case that right now, GLP-1s are touching on a mechanistic axis that has some effect in some patients in dementia, but actually if you were able to tune into it by tenfold, you might be able to get a much more remarkable effect. So I think that's probably what I am most excited for to come out of what we're doing in these products.
Maybe just to introduce one other concept, and I think it's something we have to introduce, and this speaks to the challenges of studying dementia and getting good trial results and so forth. But I am thinking about what happened during the pandemic and where there was so much social isolation of elderly people as well. And I think it's been well documented that had sort of an accelerated effect on dementia for certain populations. But I think we can't underestimate the sort of social impact. I mean, we were speaking before this panel also about the impact of hearing loss also on social isolation and sort of difficulty for elderly people in terms of accelerating dementia and so forth. So we have to put this sort of holistically, not only in the context of biological factors and drugs and so forth, but there are these social factors as well that we have to account for as we try to make advances in the field. And that's kind of a unique aspect of working in this field also.
I heard the AI is really good for this.
So thinking about what you said about the pandemic and social isolation and the role that plays, I think something else that has come out of the pandemic as well is the greater understanding and urgency and need to treat serious mental illness, depression, PTSD, anxiety, bipolar. We have started to see some new therapeutics involved and developed and approved now within these serious mental health diseases. But certainly there's a lot of runway and residual unmet need within these serious diseases. So as we think about what we talk about, like precision approaches in neurological diseases, how do we take that learning and thinking to mental health? How do we invest in mental health to really move forward treatments that are really needed for patients today?
Yeah, and this has actually been an area of interest for us at Sofinnova. So we've made several investments in biotech companies that are in that sort of neuropsychiatric area. There's Karuna Therapeutics, where they were developing muscarinic agonists, and that led to the first new approval in schizophrenia in about 30 years. Cobify, which was a major advancement. And then also a couple of other companies, Seaport and Rapport, which are going after, bipolar disorder. And it's interesting that where these are to some degree precision medicine approaches, in the sense for Seaport, it's sort of taking an old therapeutic hypothesis, but a new mousetrap, so to speak, because there's better pharmacology where you don't get as much first pass through the liver, so you don't get as much liver toxicity, so you get more therapeutic effect, on anxiety and bipolar and so forth. So using novel pharmacology and solving some of the pharmacological problems can really help, in psychiatric disease as well. So I think neurology is a broad field, and dementia is certainly a big problem, whether it's Alzheimer's or Parkinson's. And there we're sort of scratching the surface on understanding the biology. In other parts of neurology, we maybe have a little bit more of a foothold in terms of what are the neurotransmitters, where can we make advances. And so from an investor perspective, we like to make relatively de-risk investments at times, but we also like to take risks and try to make advances in important areas like Alzheimer's that has been huge unmet needs. So from an investor perspective, we try to bridge making sort of lower risk investments with also higher risk ones where we can, make a big impact as well.
Karthik, I think you're about to say something as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I think neuropsychiatry is different in one important way, which is that the context for these patients also matters tremendously, right? If you take a schizophrenia patient and you give them a M1, M4 agonist, it seems to work, but I think the thing that we have to acknowledge is that if you put them back in the same environment that they were in before, it's unclear what sort of outcomes you're going to be able to get. And so the thing I'm excited about in neuropsychiatry is the idea of combining pharmacologic modulation with therapy, right? Because most of what we do in pharmacologic modulation is basically getting after a notion of neuroplasticity, right? It's getting after a notion that if you overactivate certain centers, if you grow more spines, you put your brain into a different state. But I think the push has been, if you take a canonical model of depression, yes, there may be a physiological resilience component as to why a person develops depression, but there is also the component of what is the life situation around them that overcame that resilience barrier. And I think the world of sort of people trying to isolate out the mechanism of psychedelics, remove the hallucinogenic component, but to combine this with guided therapy sessions is actually paving the way forward for a world, I think, in neuropsychiatry where you treat patients simultaneously, both with a pharmacologic therapy, but also a behavior or a psychological therapy. I mean, some of the results with MDMA and methadone and things like PTSD are really remarkable, and I'm excited to see that combine with more classical pharmacologic modulators.
So we are here in Texas. Certainly, $50 million went to the Ibogaine research, so talking about the psychedelic research itself. Psychedelics certainly still do have a bit of stigma, but I think they are starting to be understood a little bit more in this administration, destigmatized, moving forward, really robust phase 3 data now with Compass and depression and phase 2 data in PTSD. As investors, how do you view psychedelic molecules? What does the investment thesis look like, and how do you bring them to patients?
Yeah, it's. I've looked at some of these. It's actually very tricky because I think there's this aspect where these psychedelics, they can cause this trip, if you will, which some people think is actually what's responsible for the therapeutic effect. So there's a lot of companies that are trying to sort of dial out the sort of hallucinatory component of this, and the question is, can you maintain the therapeutic effect if you dial out the hallucinatory aspect of the drug? And I think the jury's still out. There's some really interesting companies out there that are developing this. I think from a practice perspective, it's pretty complicated, and it sort of needs a different care situation. If you've got a patient who gets a hallucinatory drug for a refractory neuropsychiatric issue, and they really need monitoring for that, and it can be variable in terms of how long does that event last, and it puts a lot of burden on the care center as well. So I think you've got issues of this particular side effect, if you will, that may actually be part of the therapeutic effect of the drug, but also the complexities of how do you actually administer a drug like this in the clinical setting. It's pretty complicated. So we have to innovate in a number of ways for these types of therapies to actually be able to come forward.
Karthik, you mentioned the neuroplastogen effect itself, rewiring of brains, increased neurogenesis. Is there a possibility of developing, to your point, we don't know if the trip is critical, but is there a way of thinking about these molecules for diseases like longevity, for dementia itself, as a preventative aspect at a smaller, more chronic dose? Is that something that you think we should be thinking about investing in moving forward?
It is probably scientifically true. I would guess it is nearly impossible to prove that in a trial setting, at least the way that we know how to do that now. I think part of what makes the neuropsychiatry, I completely agree with everything you said, and if anyone wants to know why investors hate neuropsychiatry, they can read the Lykos AdCom and basically read all the reasons the FDA doesn't like psychedelics and all the issues they had with unblinding and control of therapy. But I think the real interesting thing there that isn't quite a thing in neurodegenerative disease, right, is neuropsychiatry has a care delivery model that can incorporate some of this, right? I mean, MGH has cleared out an entire floor now to start doing ketamine. People are opening up TMS centers. There's a real, largely private equity expanded infrastructure that's developing around care delivery that is both pharmacologic and therapy in nature. And so I think to the extent that we see investable innovation here, it's not going to look like classic pharmacology investing. It's going to look a little bit more like these care delivery and distribution models that combine some of these approaches.
And then certainly, Niranjan, with your work with dementia itself, have there been thoughts or considerations about these psychedelic molecules for either dementia as a preventative aspect for an active treatment, or tying back to the mental health concerns that these dementia patients often do have, whether it be agitation, psychosis, or others?
Yeah, great question. Our portfolio focuses on disease-modifying approaches. So we have not taken the symptomatic alleviation into our investment thesis, I'd say maybe yet. But I do want to tie a few things here. We talked about underinvestments for lack of clear proxy measures and endpoints tied back to stigma. Oncology, cardiology, nobody has a problem saying, I have a condition, I'm going to go get treated. Mental health and dementia acceptance is very hard. Why is that? Societal stigma, consequences. More importantly, where do they derive the optimism from? What treatment do they go seek? So I think this vicious cycle has to get cut somewhere. Investment is one place where we can cut it, but I think we also need to cut the other aspects of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think there is starting to become, as we have some of these new amyloid antibodies, newer modalities for mental neuropsychiatric conditions, some of the stigma is going away, but I do see people still struggle to say, my parent has dementia, my partner has depression. It's still hard. So I think that's a great point, and we have to think about that vicious cycle, how do we break it itself? And I do wonder if that is in other neurological diseases as well. Migraine, to say I have a migraine and I cannot go to work, is there a stigma associated with that, with pain, with epilepsy? And those are other diseases where there's still significant unmet need and need for investment. So thinking of, besides neurodegenerative diseases and mental health, which in itself can keep us all very busy itself, what are some other diseases that we should be thinking about investing in across the broader neurological perspective?
Yeah, and again, going back to my wheelhouse, I guess, oncology. So when you think about the cognitive impact of cancer patients going through their treatment, whether it's a psychological impact of that, or it's the impact of radiation or chemotherapy. I mean, the sort of overused term of chemo brain is a real phenomenon. And I think as we're doing a better job having patients live longer and curing patients, it's also important that we focus on survivorship or really make sure that we take care of those patients that have successfully gone through cancer treatments that may have some longer lasting side effects from that. And some of those are absolutely going to be cognitive as well. So I think there's a great opportunity as we think about investing in dementia, cognitive decline, and so forth, to also think about, cancer patients, because, if you're diagnosed at a young age with cancer and you've gotten strong chemotherapy and you have that cognitive impact, you've got hopefully a long life ahead of you, and you want to have as much mental function as you possibly can there. So I think that's an unmet need area as well.
And so I'm going to open it to the two of you as well about other diseases we should be thinking about investing in.
I'm going to flip it around and say, more than studying diseases, I want to study the centenarians who don't have any disease. I want to understand, how are they resilient? What drives their cognitive resilience? What are those secret sauces in them that we could perhaps take lessons from?
I think you mentioned, several of them. Epilepsy has seen some truly remarkable results in just the last 24 months. There's a company, Neurona, that has a cell therapy that, took, teenagers with 20, 30 seizures a month and brought it down to sub 5 and in some cases 0. These are some really stunning results. Rapport has a new mechanism that innovates on an older drug called perampanel that also similarly gets 70% reductions in seizures. All of these things are are linked, right? So whether it's epilepsy, whether it's what the advancements we're seeing in pain with the NaV 1.8, I suspect Vertex and others will combine NaV 1.7 with 1.8 and get an interesting synergy there. Whether it's novel mechanisms in migraine, right? So for a long time we've been stuck with the CGRPs, but PACAP now seems to be a real mechanism in migraine. All of these conditions link back to a broader course of neurodegeneration. They link back to a broader course of neuropsychiatric disorder. And so, I try to be an optimist about these things, and I say we have to go after what we can go after now. And right now, that's what it looks like. We can go after ALS, Huntington's, epilepsy, migraine, pain. Those are things that we feel like we know how to do clinical trials. And you just have to hope that by chipping away at some of those things over the long course of time, we will chip away at problems like dementia and mental health disorders.
Absolutely. Almost at the end of our time here, I just want to leave with one other question, thought. Obviously, the goal is disease-modifying therapeutics, but there's still a lot of unmet need for treating symptoms of these diseases. And one symptom is depression. A patient with epilepsy, is their depression the same as a patient with MDD? Is their depression the same as someone with dementia itself? So how do we think about developing and investing for symptomology of these diseases itself across these neurological diseases?
Can I just say, I think we're going to have to come back to, let's not call it one thing. I mean, not all depression is the same.
Exactly.
So we need to start subtyping these. And you can solve some, you may not be able to solve some of the others.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. Please.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, there are these complex forms of depression where you've got, other factors. I mean, dual diagnosis, if you will, sort of depression, alcohol use and so forth. And so that is a more complex problem statement. And I think that's, when I used to do internal medicine, that's when you refer on to the psychiatrist or the specialist, because that is an order of magnitude more difficult from a problem statement perspective. So I think that's where maybe the depression comes out of the primary care doctor's hands and moves into the specialist's hand when you've got, more of a dual diagnosis situation.
So I just wanted to thank the three panelists. This was a fantastic conversation. I think there's a lot more to be thinking about. And I'm thinking about what Harris said at the end of the day yesterday, that we need to have investment vehicles. We need to be thinking about investing in this a lot more seriously and holistically itself. So glad to see that this is coming to fruition, but there's a lot more to be done, and looking forward to have everyone in this room really helping to contribute to invest across these diseases. So thank you all so much. Really appreciate it.